and welcome to this episode of the Student Outcomes Podcast. I'm your host, Sarah, and I'm a co-founder and research director at Cosmos, where we're really passionate about empowering educators and elevating students. I hope you enjoy this episode. Boys, Barriers and the Burden of Masculinity, a deep dive with Alex Blower, the boys expert.
Why we've got these disparities in educational outcomes, why we've got such high rates of death by suicide, why we've got significantly higher representation in the homeless population, the criminal justice system, and more likely to be having issues with addiction and substance misuse.
So Dr. Alex Blower is an influential figure in the field of educational equity, particularly focusing on the disparities faced by working class boys in accessing higher education. Both his research and professional work focus on supporting marginalised groups, with a particular emphasis on boys eligible for free school meals. And in 2023, Dr. Alex Blower founded Boys Impact, a UK-wide network aimed at addressing the educational attainment gap for boys from disadvantaged backgrounds. Dr. Blower's expertise has been sought for various national and international publications, and he has become a regular speaker at conferences. Here he discusses masculinity, social mobility, and educational inequality.
If you've got men in society that are struggling with or negotiating any of those issues, the chances are far, far higher that they would later be adults who may be perpetrators of some of the things that affect women. And what we've got is a position with Andrew Tate and social media and the manosphere, where actually there is a very, very appealing, very, very simple explanation of what it means to be a man and how to be a man and how you can be financially rewarded through that enactment of masculinity.
I'm your host, Sarah Dirrane, co-founder and research director. The Student Outcomes Podcast is brought to you by Cosmos. Cosmos work in the education sector and improve outcomes for disadvantaged students. Lovely. So, Alex, welcome to the Student Outcomes Podcast. Really, really great to see you here today. Thanks for taking the time.
No problem at all. Thank you for having me.
No worries. So I think we're going to get straight into it. I want you to, if you're able to kind of summarise the work you do and why you do it.
I guess the reason why I do the work that I do is largely based on personal experience and a sense of frustration, anger at injustice that's never really left me. So my work that I do as a professional is all around education and inequality in various different forms, but I have a particular focus on masculinity and the experiences of working class young men in education and trying to do something about the stark disparity we see in their educational outcomes. Reason being for that is originally I'm from a small town in the West Midlands that's an ex-mining town. I had a bit of a bumpy ride in education myself. I missed a lot of time at school due to mental ill health. And then in an ill-advised attempt to kind of ingratiate myself back into school and make some friends in high school, I ended up doing a load of things that I shouldn't and getting expelled. When I got expelled, I moved to a school about 6 miles away in a very middle-class, affluent area. A place where at school you wore a blazer and a tie rather than a jumper and a polo shirt, and everybody was talking about what you were going to do when you went to sixth form and to university instead of what job you were going to do when you left school, where you could put your hand up in class and answer a question and not worry about what might happen to you as a result of break time. So it's just a very, very different environment. What that meant when I eventually got to university, I went to the University of Wolverhampton and then started working afterwards in higher education outreach, was that I looked at the percentages of people from my hometown and the school that I went to when I got expelled that were likely to go into higher education. For my hometown, it was about 18%. For this school, it was about 64%. And I've got mates with more talent in the little finger than I've got in my whole body, who just due to circumstance and the inequalities experienced kind of geographically and the school they went to, never got the opportunities to fulfill some of the dreams and ambitions that I know that they held. You know, I've got a couple of mates who later on in life now have gone to university as mature students. One's a mental health nurse, one's a counsellor, and they're doing fantastic, really, really meaningful work. work that they've always wanted to do and work that they were well equipped to do had they had the opportunities and the resources made available to them to do at age 18. Instead, they've had to do it in their 30s. They've had to encounter significant financial risk, the insecurity and precariety in terms of family situation and housing, and a massive roll of the dice on all of that onto whether or not they're going to pass these courses in university. And that's simply not fair. And there's a whole host of reasons why that happens, and it really made it my ambition and my career to do something to change that for other young men who might be encountering similar challenges.
Yeah, thank you for that, Alex. I think the passion that you've got there just comes across so strongly. I was interested as well to maybe unpack a little bit. You spoke about what struck me in that what you just said there was talking about the fact that when you went to a different school and you were in a different environment, and almost the ethos and kind of the value and perception towards schoolwork changed, that seemed to be a bit of a turning point. Is that right? Or
yeah, it was still a space that I enjoyed, I'd say. It was very, very different. It was a whole different game with completely different rules that I kind of had to relearn. The things that would make you kind of popular, or kind of gain traction with friendship groups and that type of thing in my old school just didn't work at this new school. If you were overtly anti-authoritarian or you wanting to go for a cigarette at break time, then you weren't one of the cool kids if you did that. Instead, the cool kids were ones that seemed to do well in sports, that were on track academically, that still did all of those things that they shouldn't do, but were just a lot more sneaky about it. Instead of sorting out things with physical altercations and fights, they didn't happen anywhere near as much. And bullying was different, rather than it being pushing and shoving and physical, it was much more psychological at this new school. Really, actually, in some elements with that, of the types of things that used to go on. So I'd be at pains to say it wasn't better, it was different, in terms of the environment. However, what it meant within this new school context was that there was a legitimacy placed on gaining educational qualifications, educational progression, and an unwritten expectation that would be the case that just simply wasn't there in my other school for a variety of reasons. So, I mean, my experience is at that second school were characterised by teachers having systematically low expectations of me, letters home every single week from the head of year, sometimes reporting on things that I'd done, sometimes fabricating things that I'd done, really dismissive reports by teachers at the school. But I'd got into a position where I knew that education was important to me, and that I wanted to do well to prove them wrong as much as anything, because I knew I could win arguments with them in the classroom. I started to find ways where I could get my point across, or shine my dissatisfaction in a way that was clever enough that it didn't get me chucked out of the class. Those types of things were things that happened increasingly, and that railing against the low expectation and saying, right, despite you and what you think, I'm going to prove you wrong, was a real kind of motivator. And that was facilitated by access to all of these opportunities that I didn't have when I was at the other school, and that just simply weren't available. School.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think obviously it's clear that you have a real kind of drive to, you spoke about there, the inequalities and the frustration around some of the outcomes, and that you kind of dedicating your work to that, to helping young boys almost kind of see their full potential, to be able to kind of live up to their full potential in terms of their outcomes. So what are the outcomes that we're currently seeing for boys, and particularly boys on free school meals?
So right across the country, across the UK and a lot of the rest of the world, there's a really stark disparity in outcomes, both in terms of kind of key stage 4 progression, so GCSEs and attainment. Typically, I mean, in terms of how it looks, boys overall are doing kind of less well in their GCSE outcomes than young women. But when you add free school meals into the mix, then it really, really compounds that inequality. So across Dorset in 2022-23, Dorset is where I'm based at the moment. We saw 19% of young men who were eligible for free school meals achieving a 9 to 4 in GCSE English and Maths, compared with nearly double that figure for young men that weren't. So it's really, really significant. If we frame it like that, then
that's kind of currently happening as we speak.
That's post-pandemic. Yeah, so that's 22-23 Department for Education data. And what we know is that means that over 8 out of 10 young men who are eligible for free school meals in Dorset aren't getting those necessarily qualifications to progress on into a level 3 study that could facilitate eventually progression into higher education. I think I said grade 9 to 4, and that is actually grade 9 to 5. So I just want to correct that because it is higher.
Okay, yeah, no, that's fine. And can you help us understand why some of these outcomes exist? What are the root causes? Because obviously we met at your recent Boys Impact conference, which was absolutely amazing. I do have some a vlog and a few takeaways on my own LinkedIn profile if anybody wanted to check that out, and I'll put some notes in the show notes to that as well. But I suppose as an aside to that, yeah, we spoke a lot there about the outcomes and the fact for these young men, and the fact that it's just been consistently low for such a long time. Can you help us understand, why these outcomes still exist and they're still so prevalent?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of commonly held stereotypes and assumptions that are simply incorrect, that a lot of the time have driven activity in this space to try and redress the balance, which, even though it's been happening, has been pretty sparse, to be honest with you. Those assumptions that we hold are stereotypical notions surrounding young men lacking aspiration. Boys will be boys, they're lazy. Boys like competition. Boys don't like to read. All of these tropes that have accompanied any conversation surrounding this issue for about the last 40 years or so. And that's how long we're talking about, at least, this issue being one that has been really entrenched within our educational system. We can go back to the work of Paul Willis in kind of Learning to Labour in 1977, and kind of chart a course in academic research and policy conversation since then that has addressed and redressed and articulated and re-articulated this issue without any significant strategic activity happening. I think that's partially because it's a really contentious issue. If we're talking about masculinity in a wider context of gender-based inequality, then how on earth can you chart an equitable way forward in work with young men? But also, what we've seen is a complete lack of appreciation of the evidence behind what's going on and the truth to what's going on, which is that these issues are messy, they're complex, they involve things to do with mental health, peer pressure, kind of sex and relationships, student expectations, socioeconomic inequality, teacher expectations. And I think that's a big one because it is very, very difficult, I should imagine, as an educator who's working incredibly hard on these issues, to see that actually some of the challenges might lie in the way that you approach the issue, or young men in education, or the school culture that kind of holds these young men in those educational spaces as well. So there isn't one clear silver bullet or reason why for these disparities that we see in educational attainment and progression to higher education. If we're looking at Black Caribbean young men, then it's 20% who will enter into higher education. If we look at young white men who are eligible for free school meals, then it's 13%. That they're significantly less likely, which is no surprise, really, I suppose, given that the GCSE attainment isn't there because that pipeline isn't available. So really, to address the issue, what we need to start thinking about is how do we take a different approach that is evidence-based, and how do we start building up a bank of knowledge that we can trust and that we can draw on surrounding this issue to move forward equitably.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's interesting that you talk about this issue as being generally quite contentious, which is interesting given the statistics and the data in terms of the outcomes of these young men is so stark and so low. What do you think about the public perceptions around young boys' struggles, particularly those from working class backgrounds? You know, what are they evolving? Is there still things that are misunderstood? What do you think about the public perception?
I think there's probably in line with the way our politics have gone over the last decade, quite a polarized view of the issue that we need to actively contest to change the conversation. So from my perspective, what you see, and I'd like to make pains just to say these aren't the views that I hold. These are where I see kind of those ideological positions at the moment. On the right of politics, perhaps in the mainstream, not quite as severe as you might see with manosphere content or online content. You will have this idea that feminism has pushed men's issues out, that the feminist movement have eroded a sense of young men's place in the world and their power, and actually it's that societal change's fault, and men need to be, their role needs to be re-established and they need to be supported and they need to, regain that power. Then on the kind of far left of the political ideological spectrum, what we'll see is people who want to correct and recognise the issues that might be taking place in education in school classrooms linked to, again, manosphere, Andrew Tate, misogyny, kind of sexual harassment, and all of those things. And there are examples, I won't name any names, but examples where I can draw from, where we've seen young working class men being engaged with in education as though they're perpetrators of all of these things in waiting. Like, they are already, holding responsibility for those acts that they haven't done and may never do.
So they're already assumed to be a certain way when there's no evidence to say that that's the case.
Yeah, and if you've ever been into an alternative provision and work with young men that have, been marginalised education, and you go in with that approach, that deficit-driven approach, there's only one way that engagement's going to go, and it's not going to be productive. So what we see is that these are kind of the two positions almost that get the airtime in the media.
It's a good two very, like you say, polarising extremes.
Yeah, but if we look at education, so I use a quote by J.J. Bowler all the time from a book called Mask Off, which is what J.J. Bowler says is that the patriarchal societal structures are this double-edged sword, this poisonous panacea that puts them in an advantage in society, but at the same time it limits them and inhibits their growth and causes great harm for them as well. What J.J. Bowler's getting at with that is that the way the world around us, educational, societal structures are set up at the moment, is we live in a world where the societal harms that are caused to women are gender pay gaps, sexual harassment, violence against women and girls, all of those really deep, stark and harmful inequalities and the experiences that go on that edge of the sword. On the other edge of the sword, there's things that cut men. There are reasons with that edge of that sword why we've got these disparities in education outcomes, why we've got such high rates of death by suicide, why we've got significantly higher representation in the homeless population, the criminal justice system, and more likely to be having issues with addiction and substance misuse. These two things are true at once. And actually, if you've got men in society that are struggling with or negotiating any of those issues, the chances are far, far higher that they would later be adults who may be perpetrators of some of the things that affect women. So by working with young men specifically through a strengths-based approach to create the circumstances where they can work towards a happy, healthy future, where, they're educationally engaged, where they can expect to be great fathers, great husbands, family members, then we're contributing towards an endeavour which is changing those patriarchal societal structures. And that's really what the work of Boys Impact and kind of what we're pushing for as an organisation is all about. We want to break down these silos in education, which say you've got young entertainment over here, maybe aligned to the right. You've got misogyny in schools and all of these things that are really harmful for young men, that are changing their view of the world in a way that might not be positive over here on the left. And you with young men either for attainment or for that, when actually what we're speaking about is whole young men in education. They don't operate in these silos. Their time in the classroom isn't spent in an attainment box and their views on the world box. So what we need to do to create a shared narrative and way forward is to smash those silos. We need to work with the whole young man and accept that these things are intrinsically linked together, just like their place in the world is intrinsically linked to all of these things.
Yeah, I love how you've kind of laid that out, Alex. I think you've laid that out really eloquently and and really clearly, in the sense that, it actually we are siloing these young men, and these issues aren't mutually exclusive. Like you say, it's very complex, and you need to look at the whole picture holistically, not just take one problem over here and one over there. There's not that tension. It is, you need to look at it together. I love that. I think that was a great way to put it. And I suppose on that point then about looking at the whole young man, I think you've generally been really open about your own kind of mental health struggles growing up as a young man from a working class background. How do you think growing up in poverty impacts young boys' mental health?
I think it's in numerous ways is the easy answer, a lot of different ways. But one of the things that I think comes out quite clearly is anxiety and risk, about the precariety that they might be experiencing, of the additional roles potentially that they might be performing at home because a parent is working an awful lot to try and make ends meet. A feeling of responsibility potentially for financially contributing to the household to support or finding ways and mechanisms to do that. Their responsibility to care as well. If we're looking at inequalities and areas that might experience socioeconomic inequalities, then health outcomes amongst adults are also not likely to be as good, which could in turn increase the chances of that young person being a young carer. If I look at my own experience and having a close family member who had significant issues with mental ill health and addiction, then the mental health challenges that I developed were born out of experiences that were passed on intergenerationally. My dad, had his own struggles. His father, my grandfather, died at an early age because he had his own mental health problems and struggles with addiction and alcohol as well. And this is one of the things that we see. It is not, a lot of the time we treat young people, working class young people, men or women, in isolation, as though they float free of all of these historic conditions that they lived within, the collective memory, as Diane Ray would call it, of these communities and histories. And it's no surprise that that intergenerational baton of these challenges was passed, and you saw it because of the resulting childhood experience from me, the developing anxiety, the educational disengagement. There was a strong chance that I was very lucky to get expelled from school and move to this school, but if there's not a recognition of those things being so embedded, and being part of the conditions societally and the inequalities we experience, then we're never going to break that cycle. And in a lot of the work we do as higher education practitioners, as educators, as government policymakers, there's almost a reluctance to examine how deeply embedded those things are. And unless we can recognize those things and do something to address them, and then it's a cycle that I think you have to be incredibly lucky to be in a position to be able to be cognizant of and break as just an individual.
Yeah, definitely. Really important point there about, I suppose, the trauma that's passed down intergenerationally as well, it feels, and what that does to young men and how that then impacts their own educational perceptions and experiences as well. Yeah, definitely. So what I know we spoke a little bit there about gender and the fact that there are these tropes out there still that still exist and have existed for decades, decades on decades. We can't seem to get away from them. But what does it mean to be a man in 2024, would you say?
I would say it means to be in the middle of great change. It means to be part of a world that is in a process of recalibrating not only how gender roles work with regards to men and women, but actually what gender as a concept means for society in general, especially with young people, the concept and gender fluidity and, pronouns and this great societal shift and change that is happening with the way that we understand it. Well, what does that mean for a young man who might be from a working class town in the northeast of England or in Cornwall, who, through no fault of their own, haven't been provided with the cultural, social resources required to critically engage with all of that and come up with their own position based on all of the things, or the conversations that might be happening in school or with their wider networks. And what it leaves young men feeling, and Naomi Way's written a great book about this recently, Professor Naomi Way from New York University, called Rebels with the Cause, is a distinct disconnectedness and a sense of not quite knowing where young men fit or belong, or how necessarily to fit and to belong, and what is expected of them. And what we've got is a position with Andrew Tate and social media and the manosphere, where actually there is a very, very appealing, very, very simple explanation of what it means to be a man and how to be a man and how you can be financially rewarded through that enactment of masculinity. What we've got amongst
So it's always giving them, it's always giving them the answer then to what it is to be a man, when at the moment it's very kind of muddled and, like you say, in the middle. This comes in, these harmful kind of influences such as Andrew Tate and, rise of incel culture and all of that, like you say, the manosphere. And it, like you say, it gives them that very simple, this is what you need to do in order to be a man. Yeah.
Yeah, coupled with, and this is very kind of clever and insidious, the kind of matrix notion, that red pill, blue pill, the idea that if anybody tries to shut you down and your views on this or close down a conversation, that's because they're operating in this big societal system and structure that's designed to get you, that's designed to close down these conversations. And what it means for teachers in schools who are desperately trying to counter some of this stuff without necessarily having the tools at their disposal to be able to do it confidently, are closing down the conversation, which is making it worse almost, because what it's doing is playing straight into that narrative.
Is that why you think it's grown so rapidly? Sorry, Alex.
I think it's a contributing reason, definitely. And it's changing and it's evolving. When we talk about the manosphere, obviously Andrew Tate is the kind of figure that's put upon the manosphere pedestal, but there's so many actors in that space, and it is a real loose confederacy of all of these different groups with these different agendas. So it makes it incredibly difficult to kind of stem the tide, if you like, especially with social media. Andrew Tate, and I think he's been allowed back on X now, or whatever Elon Musk is doing. But his content is still tweeted, retweeted, shared, reshared on TikTok, billions of times. And it's coming from all of these other places. So it almost doesn't matter if he doesn't have that platform himself. There's this loose confederation of people that are making sure it's still circulating. And what we don't have on our side, because we appreciate that the issue is messy, it's complex, that actually it's incredibly difficult in a world that is so full of change to provide a clear, simple answer that is going to facilitate young men having a connection, then we don't have a narrative of hope to counter it with, which is
Yes,
really
it's a
sad.
good point. Yeah.
And it's why these polarized positions are even more dangerous, because we need something where we are united, where we are clear and hopeful in what we can offer as a future for our young men, especially if they experience marginalisation in education and socio-economic inequality and have those whole other range of pressures on their shoulders that might make the allure of something simple, more attractive. That's one of the things that we're very, very keen to be working on with Boys Impact, with the research that we're doing, with the work with young men in education. And it's why it has to be strengths-based, and it's why we have to celebrate who these young men are and what they're capable of and the things that they're proud of. Create spaces where they are happy to talk about how much they love and care for their mom, or their siblings. The thing, empathy is a good thing to show, being able to trust a mate, to have a difficult conversation about how they've been feeling and feel better as a result, to let out emotions or demonstrate emotions that aren't just anger and fear, to broaden that emotional bandwidth that is legitimate for young men to express, and make it not.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the point that you kind of pointed to there around having this counter narrative of a narrative of hope, which would almost kind of cut through all of that kind of negativity, quite well. You'd hope it would just kind of crash through all that and break all that down, and the young boys can see that actually there is another path and there is another way. And I think that's a really kind of, I suppose, positive and hopeful future to think that we can bring to these young men to kind of pull them towards that and away from, some of these, like you say, some of these tropes and ideologies that they have in the ways in which they feel they need to perform masculinity. Like you say, anger and resentment towards women and all of these really harmful narratives that you talk about there. So the other thing that we spoke about actually in relation to this when I was at the conference was, and you touched upon it there, what makes it worse is shutting down these conversations, within schools. It kind of, like you say, plays into that narrative of actually this is almost this conspiratorial kind of theory of actually, they don't want us to think like this. And like you say, it really just plays into that. So one of the alternative suggestions that we spoke about, in a session at the conference, was actually, talking to young men about the attitudes and why they think a certain way, and inviting them into the conversation, not just shutting them down, which kind of further marginalizes them. What are your thoughts on that as an approach as well?
I think it's incredibly important that we try to do that, with caveats, one of them being that I'm a man and I cannot imagine what it would be like as a female teacher to be standing in the class and having to engage with those views, knowing they are particularly directed towards somebody of my gender and me as a result of those things. So I think it can be, and I don't want to marginalise that, I don't want to brush over the fact of how difficult that would be to achieve. But at the same time, it's incredibly important that we create these spaces and that we provide as educators the tools for these young men to critically engage in discussion, to not have judgment cast down as our kind of first response, as to not aggressively close them down, but through the conversation or the discussion, potentially bringing in, okay, but what would you say to that if it was applied to your family member, or somebody that they cared about, or let's flip that. I think about if someone said to you, you couldn't go out dressed in, what you want to dress in. How would you feel? Because if we close it down, we've seen what has happened, and what has happened will continue happening, and in my view, will get worse. What we don't have, through no fault of any educators, both because of our educational system and the structures inherent within it, is naturally a way to do that effectively. If we're asking educators, on top of all of the things that they're already doing, to then, try and adopt a completely different approach to conversation surrounding manosphere, Andrew Tate, misogynistic views, then how do we achieve that? So we need to find a way to create a different space in education and in these schools for this to take place. There's some fantastic, and we have some of them at the conference, and of people in the third sector or facilitators externally who are doing amazing work on this. If you look at Mike Nicholson from Progressive Masculinity, I think is possibly one of the best examples. And there's lots of others, but it's not easy. And we need to find a way to mainstream some of the tools that facilitate these discussions, because it's the only tool that we've got in our toolbox and we need to use it.
Yeah, I think it's a good point to almost think about the actual reality of having to face that, and how we do that and how we approach that, particularly within the context of schools and the general education system, of this mission creep really generally with schools, and it's kind of like, right, now we need to tackle this, now we need to do that, and yeah, it's tricky, and I think your point around creating a different educational space is a very valid one, one that they feel that they, maybe the barriers can come down and they can kind of talk about some of those views that they hold, and like you say, inviting them into a space where you kind of almost like gently challenging, not kind of directly cutting them down, and shutting it all down, which, as we've seen, kind of makes that worse. And just speaking about some of the just pointing to some of the things that you mentioned earlier, just around, I suppose, boys' own emotional intelligence, really. And I know you've spoken about this before in some of the work that you've done as really a crucial element in young men's development. What role do you feel emotional literacy plays in closing the attainment gap for young men?
I think it's huge. There is, whether it's emotional, I suppose emotional literacy, but it's almost like a legitimacy around emotional expression that we need to create. So for me now, as someone that was a young carer and as a young man, I regularly made use of tools within my family context that were care, empathy, being emotionally articulate, giving mum and dad a hug, speaking to professionals who might be coming in related to dad's health. And that within my family context was normal. It was how we got through. All of us deployed a lot of that because that was how we coped and stood together as a family. When I stepped outside the front door and went into school, all of those dispositions would put me at risk. I'd get called gay or a woman or whatever, and actually it would paint a big target in my back. So what I did was purposefully and consciously shifted my identity as a young man at school and put on that armour, and engaged in practices that weren't the practices that I was engaging with at home, because it was a form of self-protection, whether it be risk of psychological, emotional, physical injury. They were all very, very present risks within that particular educational context. Now I'm older and I'm comfortably middle class. I don't have those risks. I have the luxury of actually seeing the empathy, the care, and emotional literacy as one of my superpowers, as one of the things that actually, if I'm standing up in front of a room full of people and I can articulate passionately some of these things, will bring those people with me. But that's not the case for young men, whose day-to-day educational contexts are a constant pull between two risks. It will be the risk of immediate harm that might come from putting your hand up in class and answering a question because of what might happen as a result afterwards. And the risk that is longer term, but certainly less significant in the moment. surrounding consequences for your educational outcomes for not doing so. So in this situation that we've created in educational spaces where there is this narrow range of legitimacy for expression of emotions, we've also created a situation where young men are engaged in a zero-sum game. It's which risk at the moment is less bad. There's no winning, but how do I lose less badly in this situation? Is it not getting beaten up, or is it not passing my GCSEs? And that's the things that we really need to unpick. And there's large structural things that we can start to do around that. A lot of people talk about the disparities in male representation in early years education, teachers, nurses. And it's almost like the reason that they think we need those things is because young men need role models, male role models, and unless they have those, then we're going to continue on this trajectory. For me, it's not about that at all. Actually, I know loads of single mothers that do an amazing job, that have raised some incredible humans. It's good role models that is needed, but there is a case to be made for diversifying our workforce, because if we have millions of men joining workforces in education, social care, health, what we are doing is overtly saying that men who possess dispositions related to empathy, care, compassion are legitimate and valuable. If we instantly just have a balance of this encouragement for careers trajectories, which is kind of women into STEM, and nothing to do with men into the care and professions, then what are we saying in terms of that balance?
Gosh,
yeah. How are we creating the conditions where that array of kind of forms of emotional expression can be more legitimate? Because again, if we just focus on the young men and say, you need to be better at expressing emotions, we're not tackling any of that wider stuff that we need to look at in order to address it at a level that means we can pass down positive batons intergenerationally.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a really enlightening point that you've made there. Yeah, we're kind of pushing women into STEM and saying actually they can do, the science, the engineering, but what about the other way around, and normalizing, like you say, that emotional bandwidth for men to feel and to have empathy, and to be able to express and show those emotions. The fact that that's not there is almost kind of this, unwritten, almost kind of rule and ideology that actually men don't get to be able to be empathetic in professional roles, or be able to feel, or have those feelings legitimized. So I think that's a great point that you make there around that, and wider societal constructs generally as well, as we've been speaking about. So we spoke before as well about boys and having a message of hope almost, and that hopefully being able to kind of cut through all of these harmful narratives that they are kind of drawing themselves towards. Do you think there are any hidden strengths or untapped potentials in boys for free school meals, and what are they? What kind of things do we need to be nurturing in these young boys?
Yeah, there's loads, and they are so numerous and so diverse, because what these young men who are eligible for free school meals are not is a homogenous blob. They are young men with their own hopes, dreams, ambitions. Some might love dancing, some might like football, some might like martial arts, some might like arts. Some will want to be accountants, other ones will want to be games designers. And that's amazing. What we need to do is celebrate the richness and diversity of that experience, and there's so much of one of the stereotypes and assumptions when it comes to young working class men is that you're only a young working class man if you're white, or you're a certain area of the country as well. When we know that's not the case, the central London or London area is full of people from working class backgrounds that have a very different life and experience and challenges and cultures to Newcastle, to Cornwall, to the values in Wales. And until we can wrap our head around the fact that young people who experience socioeconomic inequality, men or women, but especially young men who, get that stereotype a lot more, are not this homogenous blob. that are very, very different, that require the same support and care and encouragement, to find that unique gift that they can bring to the world, then I think we're going to, which we all always do with people from middle class backgrounds. Like, it's not even a thing. Of course, we're going to spend that amount of time to help them unearth that thing that really drives them forward. But I think what we can do for young men as well is broaden the array of things that we consider legitimate. So it goes back to that conversation that we were just having about entry into career and workplace professions. If we've got a young man that wants to be a carer, if we've got a young man that wants to be a midwife, or do health and social care at college, then we need to be actively celebrating and encourage that as a perfectly acceptable and legitimate form of being a young man. We don't do nearly enough of that.
Yeah, definitely. Completely agree with that. And are there any, I know you kind of mentioned that there were some really good examples that we saw of things that are working really well when it comes to working with young men on some of these issues. Are there any unexpected solutions that you've seen when we think about maybe some more of the systematic changes that need to be made?
Yeah, so one of my favourite groups of people in the world are the Taking Boys Seriously research team at Ulster University in Northern Ireland. So they were at the conference we ran a couple of weeks back, and they started large-scale longitudinal research with young men back in 2006, I think it was. Essentially, there was a peace dividend paid in Northern Ireland due to the Troubles, and one of the issues that they wanted to engage with was the experiences of young men in education, not only for all of the reasons that are mirrored this side of kind of the pond, but also because of the risk of recruitment into paramilitary organisations and things still going on with the Troubles. And through that work, what Taking Boys Seriously have developed, and this is engagement with hundreds, 1,000 young people and tens and tens of educators in educational institutions right across Northern Ireland for the last 15 years. What they've done is develop these set of 10 principles of relational education. And they are not a silver bullet. And there is a thing that anybody can do that will be the thing that makes the difference. But what they've given us is a bit of a North Star and a roadmap in the how, because actually it's the how that's the important with this. It's how we engage with young men in education, how we can build trust and relationships, how we can value their voices, which would actually mean that educators, if we were doing all of those things really, really effectively, we probably could have a really good conversation about Andrew Tate. But at the moment, we are a long way away from that happening. So what we are doing through the work of Boys Impact, our national organisation, is using the Taking Boys Seriously principles as the foundational approach to pilot new activities and try and build an evidence base. One of the issues that we've got is, despite this activity going on, we still don't have an evidence base surrounding effective practice, despite half a century of all of these things being in existence. We don't have something that constitutes a foundation on which to build. Lots of things have happened, and usually they've started with the thing. We'll do some mentoring and that'll fix it. But we haven't necessarily thought about the impacts. We haven't thought about how, okay, we've got young men in year 9 who aren't attending school at the moment. We know we've got the Taking Boys Seriously principles and we want to see an uplift in attendance. So which are the principles that are best to use to maybe achieve that outcome? Okay, now we've got those principles we're using. How do we design an activity that incorporates all of those principles? We don't go through that. We go straight to the thing. So what we're doing with Boys Impact is creating support, infrastructure, mechanisms to robustly pilot new approaches and come together to learn from them. And in doing so, be able to provide a voice that hasn't been around before to policymakers surrounding what effective practice might look like in terms of stuff coming from Department for Education, Ofsted, etc., etc.
Yeah, I think that's an important point around building that evidence base, and then also the initiatives that you are developing are data driven. Essentially, it's driven from data and what works. So thinking then about Boys Impact Movement, so So I know we've touched on it briefly. I will put a link to Boys Impact in the show notes, but just for the purposes of where we are now, could you just give us a really quick summary of what it is, Alex?
Yeah. So I wish I had my paragraph to read off, but I don't. So I'm just going to.
No, that's fine.
And so we're a movement, essentially. We are a UK-wide coalition of educators that are committed to taking a strengths-based approach to closing the gap in educational outcomes for young men who are eligible for free school meals. And we want to do that through research, so creating new knowledge that we can equip practitioners with, in practice through piloting new approaches and ways of engaging with young men in education, and through policy as well. So working with government agencies, local authorities, to start to chip away at some of those structural things that we've spoken about, where possible, that might be significant barriers to us seeing something that constitutes significant change. So at the moment, we've got about 9 regional Boys Impact Hubs that go online across the UK. And it's a hub and spoke model. So Boys Impact will work centrally to support those regional hubs to be piloting local activity. We touched on the importance of history and geography in the experiences of young working class men, and being able to embrace all of those things in the work. So taking a regional approach means that when Darren and the East Anglia Hub are doing work in Norfolk, then it's Norfolk specific, bringing together local partners and stakeholders, and embracing the community and the specific challenges within that context in the same way that we might do in central London or down in Bournemouth as well. One of the amazing things I think about Boys Impact is we're not a company. We're not charging money for anything. You know, we had the conference and we got some sponsorship, so it was free for everyone to go to. We're just a movement and a collection of people that really, really care about this stuff, that are seeing what it's doing to our young men and our young women with the status quo continuing, and are really, really driven to take strategic action to address it. So it is a movement, one where anyone's welcome, as long as they kind of align with our principles and our approach, which is very, very much aligned to finding that new, hopeful way forward. I think we've begun to do that, but I think we're still very early on in the journey, and it's an exciting journey to undertake.
Yeah, it's very exciting. You could definitely kind of, the energy was very palpable there, and you could see that everybody was there because they cared so deeply about these issues that you're talking about, and they can see them happening and unfolding in their personal life, in their professional lives. This is an issue that kind of generally affects and touches everybody, really. So I think there's certainly power in collaboration as well, so bringing all of these different organizations and groups together for this one movement is brilliant. So how do you see initiatives like this actually just shaping the future for boys then, suppose?
I think once we build that evidence base, then we can start to speak with authority on what effective practice might look like. Just to provide an example, we are planning hopefully to undertake a large-scale pilot with United Learning, a large multi-academy trust in England, one of the biggest. They're going to be working with 15 secondary schools in 4 regions of England that are going to be piloting interventions based on the Taking Boys Seriously principles. We are picking impact indicators, so those statistical things that are important for the school's board of governors and whoever else might be looking, but aligning it all with the Taking Boys Seriously principles as well. Once we've got the findings from that pilot, we can see what's effective. And if it is effective, and it's, you know what, we're at the stage where if it's not, that's fine, because we're still learning. We just definitely won't do that again. But if it is effective, then there's the capacity to scale that out across a whole trust. And the amazing thing is that United Learning is just one. We're working with multiple multi-academy trusts in loads of different regional contexts and settings who are all taking this approach towards piloting activity, but in doing so, creating new educational ecosystems and educational cultures almost. You know, there was a Dorset Boys Impact Hub meeting yesterday. We had about 20 people around the table, a lot of school senior leaders, but also third sector organisations and the universities. And within this ecosystem now, Bournemouth University has launched a small project fund that the schools can apply to who are part of the hub for money for projects. And, there's the Being a Boy kind of project that we've got at Arts University Bournemouth. There's Ferndown Upper School, who are significantly further along with some of the work that they're doing. So they're inviting other schools across to kind of come in and do observations and have learning visits about the types of things that they do and set it up. And they're sharing their external facilitators that they've brought in with each other. And I was just sitting there thinking, I don't need to be here anymore. Actually, this is happening. This is just part of what they do and what they care about. And that's happening all over the country. And that's amazing, because when it's happening at that grassroots level and it's happening with such intensity and significance, there becomes a point where policymakers look a bit stupid if they carry on ignoring it. And we are getting into that situation.
Yeah. So I love that. And I love the fact that you kind of said, actually, I don't need to be here anymore. And I think that generally shows the power of the impact. You've almost lit this spark and it's resonated everybody, and it's almost kind of like taken off, hasn't it? And it's got a life of its own now, which is brilliant, amazing to see. And I suppose if you could imagine an education system which was almost kind of radically redesigned to meet boys' own unique needs, what would that look like?
It would be built on principles of relational education, and those taking boys seriously principles. What I will say about those principles of relational education is that they come from principles of informal education, ones that have informed youth work practice for a very, very long time, whilst taking boys seriously, have thought about the inequalities at the specific intersections of masculinity. What they're talking about with those principles and that relational approach is just good for young people. And it wouldn't take a significant amount, in my view, for there to be something that was very, very similar for young women in schools. And it's just that starting point of what does this different approach look like. If we could reignite and reinvigorate our whole youth service, then a lot of this work could be undertaken very, very quickly. When I was over in Northern Ireland, I was doing a kind of collaborative inquiry with taking boys seriously. So some school leaders and university people went out to visit Belfast and some of the work that they've done within local settings. And what became really apparent was the power of youth and community provision, of the affordance that provided for a different informal educational relationship, one where actually it would be quite easy to have an Andrew Tatey type conversation with people, but also that they were engaging intergenerationally. So they did a young mums hub, for example, where some of the parents of some of the young people that they work with, so that they had a really great relationship with them as well. But in England, we're kind of trying to operate in a triangle with a side missing. It feels like not having that. And as a result, all of the responsibility for addressing some of these issues that are coming up socially and in society are being heaped on the shoulders of formal educators, because there is that kind of gap in provision.
Yeah. And I think it comes back to connection, which what we mentioned right back at the start, wasn't it? Ultimately, it's that connection that boys need, really, to know their place and to have their place in society. Yeah, definitely. Lovely. Well, I think that's all my questions so far. And I just wanted to say that that's just been a brilliant conversation, Alex. I think you've really, you've really eloquently and clearly put forward some of the issues and the barriers that boys are facing today, what they are, what the influences are, what the structural influences are on that, and also how we can address that. So there's just a lot of hope and a lot of positivity there. And I think that's drawn a lot from your strength and your passion that comes through so strongly, Alex. It's just amazing to see. I think you're just a shining light for these boys, and please just keep doing what you do. And I know you won't stop, but it's just been brilliant to kind of see the work progress over the years that we've known each other as well. This has always been something that you've been so passionate about, even all those years back when we kind of first started had some work together, started working together.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I will talk about this stuff for days. So thank you for having me. Yeah, it's been a really, really great hour. And very much looking forward to see where we go next with all of this stuff. And if there's any listeners that want to join for the ride, then just head to boysimpact.com and drop us a message.
Yeah, definitely. And I will put that in the show notes for anybody. But yeah, brilliant. Thanks for joining us today, Alex.
No.